We're going to be talking today about our company and how we use energy and how that we hope makes a little bit of difference. So and especially in the area of global warming. First question is, what is a HARBEC and what do we actually do here in our company? We are referred to as an injection molding company. That means we make plastic parts. So if you're sitting at your desk or wherever you are and you've got a pen or something like that, anything that's plastic probably came from some form of molding. And in our case, we do injection molding. So if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, that shows the red pieces, which are injection molded plastic parts. And the gray part behind that, the two pieces, are actually the mold that was molded from. And the green part that you see coming in the back of the one on the left is the area where the melted plastic is injected into the mold. And the machine on the bottom that you see there is the injection molding machine where the mold would be mounted. And on the left picture is a handful of the plastic pellets that are melted and then through the machine on the bottom injected into the mold on the right. So altogether that makes plastic parts of all kinds, and in our company we don't only make the plastic parts, but we also make the molds that are the tools behind that. So you can get an idea of what we do here. There is a picture of an injection molding machine, and if you watch the cycle, you'll see that the plastic pellets, or the red in the hopper on the top of the machine, pushes down in through the screw, and so that tube that it's going, you see that passing through, is called the barrel, and inside the barrel is a screw. And as the screw turns, it moves the pellets closer and closer to the end point where it's heated to a fully melted condition, and the melted plastic is pushed into the mold that you see filling up the cavity in the red. Then after a period of time, the plastic part sits in the mold until it cools. And once it cools, the mold opens up and drops the part out again, closes, and then refills for the whole cycle all over again. So over and over again, the mold opens and closes and the parts fall out. We're talking about all these events that are happening in our company, from melting plastic to operating the machines, opening and closing them. We have to light the space so that our tool makers and machinists and machine operators can see where they're going and what they're doing. We need to heat it and cool it, and we need to ventilate it because of the smells from melting plastic and things like that, and a lot of other things. And all of these things that I'm listing here require something to make them happen, a common thing to make them happen. In our case, the energy most used is in the form of electricity. A sense of the size or the volume of electricity that we use, in other words, the huge amount of it, we use more than 3 million kilowatt hours a year. And that's a lot of energy. So it makes an impact, and that's the reason for quantifying that, so you can get an idea that it's a sizable amount, and so there's therefore a sizable impact. What's the result of using this energy? And in most cases, energy, so as you're sitting at school today, the energy that's lighting your room and driving your projector and all of those things is coming from some place, usually it's the utility company, burning a fuel of some kind and producing the electricity and then sending it to you. So whether you're doing it at your own location or, like most people, at a utility company, it still is an event that is burning fuel. and the burning of that fuel has an impact. So just like you need to eat food to make sure that you keep yourself going, our machines and our tools and all that need to eat the electricity. The result of that, though, is that when this fuel burning event happens, we emit greenhouse gases. So electricity is one of the products of burning the fuel, but the other products are the greenhouse gases, and also forms of pollution like mercury and other toxins that are put into the atmosphere. So, and on top of that, not only are we releasing these uh, things into our atmosphere, but we're also using up natural resources. And we only have one Earth, and that Earth only has so many natural resources. And so, if we're good, considerate, resourceful people, we don't want to use it all up. We want to try to make it last and to make sure that we have enough for our needs now, but that we're not wasteful, so that we don't waste the energy that the people in the future are going to need. So the examples of the non-renewable natural resources means that's all there is, and we need to take care of them. You'll see examples of these fuels that the utilities companies use to make the electricity. They're oil, natural gas, and coal. And if you look at the chart, you can see that they're made in different periods of time, but all of them are made millions of years ago. So even the most recent ones, like oil, in the last up to 65 million years, to the natural gas at 140 on average, and coal 300 million years ago. So it takes the Earth a very, very long time to basically digest dinosaurs and turn them into different forms of non-renewable energy that we can use to do our needs of today. But when they're gone, they're gone, and that's another point of concern, that we don't use them all up so that the future has an opportunity like we have. There's a listing to give you a sense of perspective of what our company's 3 million kilowatt hours of use is equal to. So in 3 million kilowatt hours of electricity, the CO2 that is emitted from the utility or an engine of some kind to make that electricity is equal to what would be created by 406 cars driving in an average year, or from burning of 231,000 gallons of gasoline. That's enough gasoline to fill 27 tankers. Or another comparison would be to natural gas cylinders and propane cylinders like your parents might use in your barbecue, and or 11 more than 11 rail cars full of coal, or enough electricity to power 258 American homes on the average for a year. So you get a sense of it's a very large amount of energy and a large amount of results then that come from that. The greenhouse gas phrase that we've been using, what does that actually mean? Well, the Earth has an atmosphere around it, and it's actually, and you look on the picture on the bottom, you see a large band around the Earth. And that band in actual, it's exaggerated here, because the band of atmosphere around the Earth really, if you could see it from outer space, is incredibly thin. But to make it able so that we can talk about what's happening, we exaggerated and pushed it out to make it look very large. So this thin, fragile atmosphere that surrounds our planet, while it provides all of our air and oxygen that we need and to live, and it prevents the sunlight from frying us. If there was no atmosphere, we would not be able to withstand the rays of the sun. So the atmosphere, not only can we breathe it, but it also is a shading or filtering device, so it protects us from the sunlight. But as the sunlight comes through, it unfortunately becomes a trap, because the intensity of the sunlight is so much that it doesn't all get absorbed by the planet or us, and some of it bounces back. And as it bounces back, it hits the outer edge of the atmosphere where the CO2 and water vapor and things like that are trapped, and bounces back again. And that effect of that is called a greenhouse gas. So that's where the word comes from. And that, if you look at the picture on the top, is one of a greenhouse. If you've ever been in a greenhouse, in the summertime, you have to open every door and window possible on a greenhouse, or it will get so hot that it will kill the plants inside. And so that's a simple example, and that's why they picked the word greenhouse to describe the effect that happens from this extra sunlight getting trapped inside of the atmosphere. And so the more CO2 we release into the atmosphere, the more thick or impenetrable that layer gets, and the more the sunlight is trapped inside and keeps us getting warmer and warmer, like the greenhouse in the summertime, that you have to be careful that it doesn't kill the plants. Talking about CO2 coming from the utility plants, like I mentioned, there's a picture on the top, and you can see that very large building has stacks on the top, or smokestacks. And the purpose of those is because inside of the building is generators, and they are engines of some kind that are connected to electrical generators. So they're sort of like a motor, but in reverse. A motor takes electricity and uses it to spin. A generator takes the spinning that's coming from an engine running and turns it into electricity. But the result of that spinning and making of the electricity is the burning of the fuel, which creates the exhaust, which those large tall stacks are trying to get it way up into the sky so that it doesn't blow down on the community again. That's why they're always so tall, so that they can move it up as high as possible and get it into the atmosphere. And to give you a perspective, based on the U.S. average of utility fuel mixes, so that some plants use coal, some generating plants use oil, some use natural gas, and some use nuclear. But they're all fuels, and they're all consumed by engines of some kind that are all spinning the generators to make the electricity. And based on all the average of different types that there are in the United States, the average amount of pounds of CO2 that's emitted for every kilowatt hour is 1.5 pounds. So every kilowatt hour, and if you, to put perspective of what's a kilowatt hour, if you had 10 100-watt light bulbs and you turn them all on and you run them for an hour, that's a kilowatt hour. 1,000-watt hour, that's what kilo stands for. So you have, as a result of lighting those 10 electric light bulbs, someplace, whether it's at your building or at the utilities building, a fuel has been consumed and an exhaust has been put out, and 1.5 pounds of CO2 has been put into the atmosphere. We begin to talk about taking responsibility for that. So most times, I think it's safe to say, people don't think about that. They just turn on their light or plug it in and let somebody else worry about how and where the energy comes from. But our company is different for a number of reasons. A long time ago, we started feeling like we should be responsible for that. And if we're going to use all this energy, we should try to use it as responsibly as we possibly can. And so the result of that was we began to think of different ideas of ways to improve our results of needing all this energy. And so we talked about this word ecoeconomics. We didn't invent the word, we heard it from other people, but it fit really well with what we were doing, because ecoeconomics means that you are economical and ecological decision. So you not only, because in a business, just like in your home, you have to be careful of how you spend your money, or you'll get to the end of the week and you won't have enough money to buy groceries or put gas in the car or whatever. So the same thing happens in a business. You have to be careful all the time and make sure you spend your money correctly. So you can't just go buying things like wind turbines or solar panels and all of that unless there's a way to economically do it. So ecologically, it helps the planet, and economically, it helps your business or your family to be economically positive, or have good cash flows, or enough money to do the things that you need to do. And so, to put this into perspective, by using the eco-economic decision-making, where we not only think about is it a good deal, but also is it good to the environment, we end up dealing with this CO2. And as we do that from the ecological way, and as we do that, we end up in the end saving money, and the money that we save is what we use to buy the alternatives. One way to equate the results of this is to compare it to the amount of forest of an acre. So what is if you're going to have CO2 in the atmosphere, that's not necessarily a bad thing, only if you have too much of it. And the reason why it's not a bad thing is because plants need CO2. So the wonderful thing about the world that we live in is that we breathe in oxygen and give off CO2, and so do all of the animals. But all of the plants and the trees breathe in CO2 and give off oxygen. So it's a wonderful relationship, and if we keep it in balance, everything works out really well and everything is happy. And in fact, 1 acre of trees, of an average forest, will consume 3 tons of CO2 every year, or 6,000 pounds. So a very significant amount of the CO2 that's produced can be taken care of by the plants in the world. So that makes trees pretty important. And when we cut down a tree, that means we need to think carefully about that, because are we taking away from our ability to consume this CO2 that we just produced when we turned on a light or started our car engine or something like that? So an alternative, and one of our savings opportunities at HARBEC, is that we make renewable energy. And so now we're not talking about non-renewable like oil, coal, natural gas, and nuclear fuels. Now we're talking about a fuel that lasts as far into the future as we can possibly imagine, as long or longer than people will ever be here. And so in regards of using it resourcefully, we don't quite have to worry about that like we did with non-renewable fuels, because the wind is going to blow and the sun is going to shine and water is going to flow. So we know that we're going to have these different types of energy available to us virtually forever. One of our eco-economic decisions to help our company was in the area of renewable energy and specifically wind power. And if you look at that picture, you see uh, off in the distance, we had to get far back because the wind turbines are very large so that we could see the whole building with the two wind turbines in there. But the one on the right side of the two is our first wind turbine, and it's actually the smaller wind turbine. It's 250 kilowatts, which means that's the most power that it can make at one time when the wind is blowing at least 20 miles an hour. And the second one behind it, or on the left side of the picture, is actually twice as tall and twice as big in diameter, and it's an 850 kilowatt machine. So that means it can make 850 kilowatts of electricity at one time. If you add up the total amount then, based on our location, and it's referred to in the world of wind power as a wind site, and our site is called a class 3 or about average. But all of this is predictable in the world of wind energy, and so before we put the turbine up, we were able to calculate how much energy the machine would make for us, because the wind average is repeatable in any location, except for extremes like on the sides of mountains and that. But in generally populated places, the wind output per year is predictable to plus or minus 10%. And even though it seems like it's windier now or not so windy at another time, if you average it out over a year, that means you can predict what the wind will give you. And if you know that number, then you can predict how much energy the machine can make. So we know that this 200, before we even bought the machine and put it up, we knew that the 250 kilowatt first wind turbine would give us 300,000 kilowatt hours a year. And if we look at the impact of that at 1.5 pounds of CO2, like we talked about, per kilowatt hour, that's 450,000 pounds or 225 tons of CO2 that not only will we get the 300,000 kilowatt hours of electricity to be about 10% of our total that we need, but we also will not result in 225 tons of CO2. So we did the first wind turbine and took the money that we did not have to pay the utility for the 300,000 kilowatt hours a year, and we used that to pay for the wind turbine. It took about 8 years for us to pay for the wind turbine. But the beauty of it is the wind turbine, based on the world average of performance of these kinds of machines, is 25 years to engineering rebuild. That's the term that they use. That means, based on all of these turbines in the world, you can expect, on average, that it will last 25 years until it needs to be rebuilt, which is a lot of time, more than 8 years. So although it took us 8 years of using our utility offsets because we didn't have to buy the electricity, after the 8 years, that money that we would have had to pay for the machine or pay to the utility, we get to keep. So that's a sizable amount of money, and that's a very positive impact on our company's bottom line, or our pocketbook, if you would. And so it was so positive that after the first 8 years was done, within a month, I was already starting to try to figure out how to put the second wind turbine up. And I would put more up if I had more room, but they only have so much land around our building, and so that's as much. The 2 turbines are the most that we can put up. And the second wind turbine I mentioned is a larger machine, and it, as you can see, has the ability to do 1.7 million kilowatt hours of electricity per year, and again at 1.5 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour, that's 2.5 million pounds of CO2, or 1,275 tons of CO2 that is not emitted into the atmosphere by you as a result of using this large amount of electricity, or 1.7 million kilowatt hours of electricity. The renewable energy then, that for number 2 in our savings, and I'm listing off number 1 savings as our wind turbines, and number 2 savings of CO2, that 200,000 or 2 million rather kilowatt hours approximately from the 2 wind turbines is not enough to do all of our energy. So we still have about 1 million kilowatt hours, give or take a little bit, that we need to come up with. And so one of the ways, about half of it, or 600,000 kilowatt hours a year, we buy electricity from the grid or from the utility company. But we do it differently than just buying the cheapest electricity that we can get, which is always made from coal, and then or other fuels, depending on what your utility does. And instead, we pay a little extra to buy green power from them. So that means we make the utility, and this is for people who buy their power from the grid. And most of the United States has this capability today. You can call your utility company and say, I would like you to make all of my electricity green or from some form of renewable. I don't want you to use any non-renewable fuels to make my electricity. And by law, they have to do it. So what you're doing when you make that call is really accomplishing the same thing that we have done here by putting up expensive wind turbines or solar panels and things like that, because you make the utility. They will charge you a little bit extra for it, but it's not very much. And the neat thing about it is that over time, the renewable energy part should stay the same price. So even if you have to pay a little bit more for it today, as time goes on and we use the fuels more and more, they become more and more expensive. So in the utility world, if you are using fuels and or you're buying the electricity from those utilities, the only thing that you know for sure is that the cost will, based on the trend, continue to rise as time goes forward. In other words, it will get more and more expensive every day. And if you look back into history, it will prove to you, because the trend line only goes up. There are little instances of time when it'll go down and up again and down, but if it trends, it's constantly going up. And the reason why is the fuel is getting harder to get, more expensive, and therefore the price of the electricity is continuing to go up and up. Renewable energy doesn't use any of these fuels. It uses the wind and the sun, and they are the same price today that they will be in 5,000 years from now, which is totally free. So if you sign up for this renewable energy and your utility is fair, in a very short time, relatively speaking, your electric bill should be lower than the non-renewable energy source. And so when we buy this 600,000 kilowatt hours of green energy from our utility, that equals another 450 tons of CO2. This is our generating plant. So in the picture on the left, you can see a normal utility model where the buildings, the square boxes on the left side of the inverted mushroom chimneys there, is where the electricity is made, and then it follows the orange and white dotted line, and it goes out to the grid, which is the wires and everything that takes it to your houses and to the schools and buildings and all of that. That's the normal distribution of electricity that most of us know about. But at HARBEC, we found another way to reduce CO2, and that is by making the electricity ourselves. So on the right-hand picture, you see our generating plant, and each of the devices that looks sort of like a refrigerator with a circle on the top and louvers below it is actually a microturbine generator. So inside that cabinet is an engine that's like the engines on the jets we fly in, or the airplanes. And instead of being connected to a propeller or a jet thruster, it's connected to a motor, or a generator rather. And so as the engine spins, burning, in our case we burn natural gas, and so as the natural gas turbine engine spins, it turns the generator and makes electricity. And the difference, though, that's very significant is that we're doing it right here, so we're not losing any power as it traverses over the wires to go long distances to finally get to us. And more importantly than that, we're not wasting the heat. And what does the heat have to do with it? It has everything to do with it in an amazing and discouraging perspective. And here's why. If you go over to the wall and flip the light on in your classroom, I don't know anything about your classroom or the utility, but I only know that based on the national average of this whole country and most places where there's a utility model, when you flip the light switch on, 25% or 1/4 of the energy that was used in whatever fuel was consumed to make the electricity actually got to your switch. And 75% of the fuel, or the energy in the fuel, went to waste. And the question then is, where does all that waste happen? And usually when people come to visit us, when we're standing in the combined heat and power room that you see there on the right, our generator room, I ask them that question, and everybody most frequently guesses that the majority of the loss is through the power lines. In fact, that's not where it is. That's a very small percentage. The majority of it is in the heat, and that's the purpose of those chimneys that you see, or those inverted mushroom cylinders behind the generating plant. They are disposing of the heat. They call it waste heat. And we at HARBEC keep the heat. So you see the pipes that come out of the top of those turbines, and in between the discs that you see, there's a large metal box that has a pipe coming out of the top of that, and all of these are connected to that box, and every 4 turbine engines delivers its exhaust heat to one of those boxes. And inside the box is a tortuous path, or a zigzag path of baffles with tubing. And inside the tubing is water. So we run the water through the tubing. As the gas traverses through the zigzag paths, it leaves its heat, the hot engine gas, the exhaust gas, it leaves its heat in the water. And we take the water then and do jobs with it. So the jobs that we do are one example, and so we create a 200+ degree constant supply of hot water, and then we take that water out to do different jobs in our company, like heating. In this part of our company where that room is, there are 17,000 feet of rubber tubing buried in the concrete floor. So in the wintertime, in the north where there's 8 inches of snow outside and it's 20 degrees out, the heat to heat our whole plant comes from just running the hot water through our floor. And it's a wonderful, pleasant kind of heat, so we don't have to have any furnaces that would burn oil or gas or coal. We don't have to have any boilers or any of those devices that would burn fuel again to make the heat or the air conditioning that we need. And instead we use this heat that comes from from our engines. Unlike the utility, who throws them up the chimneys or into the lakes. Like our local utility is on the edge of Lake Ontario. And so it doesn't have to have the big chimneys. It just pushes all the hot water or the heat energy out into the lake and uses the lake as a heat dump. But the energy has value, as we demonstrated by using it to heat and air condition the building with. As a result of doing that, we're just the opposite of the utility. So we still have some waste that goes up our chimney, but 65 to 75% of the energy in the natural gas fuel that we're burning, we use. And only about 25 to 30% is exhausted through our chimneys. And so, and that 25 or 30% is a target for us. And that means it's a goal for us to do even better in the future and to continue to improve and figure out other ways of using this thermal potential. As a result of all of this awareness and use of the thermal, we have a couple of things happen. In number 3, 500,000 kilowatt hours of combined heat and power. That's what we call it, because we're not only making the electricity, but we're using the heat too. 500,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. So remember, it was 600,000 the last page, and now 500,000. Now we're getting up into our 3 million kilowatt hours of electricity per year. And so the 500 or so kilowatt hours that come from this would be 375 tons of CO2. And our engines are so clean running, they are 90% reduction of emissions of CO2 compared to those chimneys that you see on the normal utility plant. So if we took the 375 tons and credited it for that, it's actually 340 tons of CO2. Also, the value of the energy that we would have had to consume to make the heating in number 4 and air conditioning requirements is another 200 tons of CO2 that is not emitted because we're not burning any fuel or electricity to make those. Our CO2 savings number 5 is our vehicles. Whenever we need a vehicle to move our products or our people around, we always try to get the most either alternative fuel vehicles like biodiesel in our truck, or hybrids like the Volt, or now we've traded the Volt in on a Tesla and the Prius. All of these are as energy or fuel efficient vehicles as we possibly can find. And so the result of these choices about vehicles is another 10 tons of CO2 and we calculate this and add it all up at the end of the year. The savings number 6 are all of our machines, which you see a picture of our molding shop floor. Behind those two guys are our molding machines, and we use all electric machines versus hydraulic machines. And one of the reasons why is by paying a little bit more for an electrically operated machine versus a hydraulically operated machine, we have an opportunity to save as much as 50% energy. And so we pay a little bit more for the machine at the beginning, but over time the machine gives us that money back plus more money because by the energy savings that it provides to us. And in the end, this produces another 405 tons of CO2 emission that are not happening because we're not burning more electricity, or we're using less electricity than we would if we used the hydraulic machines. And number 7, lighting. All of our lighting has been changed out and to LED lighting, and a very significant amount of savings from that created. Of course, remember, every time I tell you about these tons of CO2 that are being saved, it's also dollars in our pocket that are being saved because we're not buying the energy. So it's reduction of energy, and by using the LED lights, we cut our lighting bill to about 80% of what it was. And now that the lights are all paid for, that 80% of that bill keeps hitting our bottom line as a very positive impact year after year. savings number 8, that's a barrel of one of our injection molding machines where the screw is inside and the plastic traverses and is heated as it goes along. Those are heater bands on the outside. And we're melting plastic on average 350 to 550 degrees Fahrenheit 24 hours a day. So imagine those heaters making that heat in a normal room. That's going to make the room very hot, but it's also going to make the heat get away from the plastic as opposed to going into the plastic. So if in this middle picture, you see we're insulating it. So we're wrapping insulation, dense mineral wool it's called, around the barrel. And then in the right-hand picture, we close the whole thing up in a metal cover to protect it from the making sure that it doesn't rip or pieces don't fall off of it. And by keeping all that heat in to the melt area where we want it to be, another 245 tons of CO2 is saved because we don't need to make as much heat because we're using the heat more efficiently. The additional opportunities for energy savings, just to make sure you don't forget about this, if you look in the top picture, you notice that if you look closely, those are not the lights. If you look at the bright spots, those are actually skylights in our roof. And in front of those is the light fixtures, and they're off. And that process, by putting the skylights in our roof, is called daylighting. So for normal hours of the day, unless it's dark and stormy, our lights are off and the sun lights our rooms. And if it does get stormy or if night comes, we have a sensor that then turns the lights on for us so we keep a constant level of light. And the next picture, in the middle, you see what our walls are made of. That panel section there is 3 inches thick. And the brown area in the center is dense foam insulation. And the metal blue area around the outside is the metal that contains all that and provides the wall surfaces that you see. And then on the end you see the squiggly lines. That's where the 2 panels are of building our buildings are seamed together. These panels are 3 feet wide, and they go literally from the concrete block of the floor to the ceiling, and they create a perfect barrier without any pinch points from convection like a normal building construction would do. So we have a perfect barrier on our walls that is twice the required amount of insulation. And the roof's also twice insulated, and the reason for all these forms of insulation is because, do you know what the greenest energy of all is? Do you know what a negawatt is? Can you guess? It's a watt that you don't use. A nega. Don't use it. And those negawatts come from things like insulation and from avoiding the use of energy. So by double insulating our building, we know that we're going to use a lot less energy to heat it, but also to air condition it. And so we pay more money in the beginning for these extra insulations, but over time we more than get that back because of the energy that we don't have to buy. Another example of using nature to help us with our energy is behind our building. In the bottom picture you can see we have a pond. And so in that pond we save all of our rainwater. So the roof waters and the parking lot water, we collect them, all of them pitch or go towards the pond. And that means every year, and we have access, again, the rain is predictable plus or minus 10%, just like the wind. So we have on average a 1.2 million gallons of water, rainwater, that hits those surfaces and is drained into the pond. And the pond is 900,000 gallons on average, container-like, if you would. And another way that we use this is we use this as a cooling pond. So we take the heat from our process hot water loop and we run it to the bottom of our pond where it's always about 60 or less degrees. And by putting the hot water into there, we have less work for our cooling towers to do, which means less energy that they have to use. All of these things added up. So to cut to the chase, the total is 3,360 tons. And if we used trees to do the comparable amount of CO2 reduction, we would need 1,120 acres of trees, which would be a very, very large forest. So one company then, in a way that it uses its electricity and its energy of all kinds, is doing the same impact for the planet as 1,120 acres of trees. The big difference one small company can make, conscientious efforts and decisions of one company that cares, impacts CO2 global of 1,120 acres plus of forests. And in 2013, as a result of this, we became a carbon neutral company. That means when we make our plastic parts or make our machined molds and components, there is no carbon in our parts because we don't have any carbon in our energy. And for the bit of carbon that we do have from our natural gas and from our vehicle fuels, that remaining small percentage, we use carbon offsets. So we actually we add them all up at the end of the year, and we take the total of that, and we go to the marketplace and buy carbon offsets. And when you buy a carbon offset, you're paying someone else to put in a carbon reducing thing like a wind turbine or solar panels. They use your money to build those projects with. And so we are paying for somebody else to help us with that last small portion that we can't do ourselves. And in the end, we have no carbon footprint. So what can I do about it? Being everyone that's sitting in that room. And I suggest you might want to make copies of this and maybe even think about taking them home. And it'd be a great thing to sit around the kitchen table and talk to your family about it, because that's the whole thing, is we have to make people more aware of this situation that we have, because it's not really going to hurt us being grown-ups nearly as much as it's going to hurt you being the children and the grown-ups of the future. And then, so the conclusion, it's your future. And what can you do about it? Here are some suggestions. Care about Mother Earth. It is a mother. It is the mother to us all, and it's extremely important and in some ways pretty fragile. And we are proving now beyond our wildest imaginations that we can actually damage our planet. And if we don't pay attention to that, we will damage it beyond a point where we can't fix it. So ask questions. In that paper that I just showed you would be a good thing to start some of those questions. And read about it and listen for information and ideas that have to do with energy or global warming or these kinds of things. Be curious about the environment's status. Ask questions and read things about it. Respectfully make suggestions to adults. And when they say it'll be okay or they'll think of something, don't accept that, because ask the question back, who are they? Or how will it be okay? And it's important that you care enough about it that you take the responsibility to be curious and to ask about it. And then when you grow up, by the time that happens, you will become responsible users of energy and minimal impactors on the environment. Remember, it's your future that today's environment decisions will affect. It matters. Sustainability, which is a word you're going to hear more and more as time goes forward, is about living your life in a way that does not damage the chances for the future generations to have the same opportunities when their time comes. And one of my favorite proverbs I've heard in 70 years is this one that's a Native American proverb. We do not inherit the earth from our fathers. We borrow it from our children.